40 years is that that's a very powerful piece of legislation. And in fact, some of the federal court decisions show that it trumps, in many cases, long-term agreements that the federal government has entered into. And specifically, I'm talking about 100-year-old irrigation contracts between the Bureau of Reclamation and irrigators have been trumped by endangered species issues. So, in the 1980s, then, there was starting to be discussions, I guess from environmental groups in particular, about the Central Platte. And that is kind of a focal point for migrations of a lot of species. But the concern being expressed was that development in that basin, water development in particular, both in the Front Range of Colorado, so South Platte drainage, and Wyoming and Nebraska were starting to diminish the flows on the Platte River, and that potentially could imperil endangered species. The start of those discussions. Then, in the 1990s, there were discussions among
That second part
three
there.
states, Nebraska, Colorado,
Increment to
and
flow
Wyoming,
with expanded water and
environmental
land
groups
goals.
about crafting potentially a program.
That's where you can make some money,
Or assist with the
figure out
recovery
what
of
they're
those
gonna do and
And that
Tie that
culminated
shit
in
up now.
1997 with a document that's called the Cooperative Agreement. And in that document, the three states signed it, three governors signed it, as well as the Secretary of Interior. And they agreed to work together to design a program, a recovery program. And interestingly, looking at some of the old notes there, it was felt that that was about a 3 or 4 year effort to get to a recovery program. In all actuality, it took 10 years to craft that program. 10 years, the first increment, which is what we're currently in place now, that was crafted. It went through a full-blown EIS process for the NEPA compliance, record of decision, and then the Platte River Recovery and Implementation Program was then signed. The first increment was signed by the three states and the Secretary of Interior, and that's what started the program that we have. Now, interesting aspect of the program is it is in essence overseen and governed by a group called the Governance Committee. And I am Wyoming's representative on that governance committee. I was appointed by Governor Meade to serve in that role. Colorado has one representative, Nebraska one representative, Department of Interior has two, one from the Bureau of Reclamation, one from Fish and Wildlife Service. Environmental groups have 2 representatives, and then water users have 3 representatives. There is a South Platte water users group that has 1 vote. There is the Central Platte water users group has 1 vote, and then there is an Upper North Platte group that has 1 vote as well. And so those folks come together, and they are the ones that make the decisions on land to purchase, water to pursue, the research that the program would follow through with. So that 13-year program, as I mentioned, expires end of 2019. So within the first increment, and what the program document lays out are a number of goals. What do we need to do to help recover these species? And so goal number 1 was to acquire 10,000 acres of habitat in the Central Platte Reach. And it gets broken down into some subgroups, but it is primarily river bottom habitat. And the intent is that that river bottom habitat, which now is largely a cottonwood forest, would be cleared at these locations, and the viewscape opened up because cranes in particular do not like obstacles. And of course, again, we want to avoid obstacles like power lines. Certainly trees are that obstacle, but they want to be in the middle of the river in the shallow water when they roost at night so that they can see long distances and see predators. So that's been one of the intents of 10,000 acres of habitat. Microlines, least terns, and piping plovers do nest on the river, and so So there has been a program to build islands, either with bulldozers or scoopers, or with water, as the case may be. So that's the need for 10,000 acres of habitat. Then also, the goal was 130,000 to 150,000 acre feet of water to be, in essence, brought together to be managed by the program for the benefit of endangered species. And the Platte River is, both the South Platte and the North Platte are generally considered to be fully developed or fully appropriated. I mean, you can still get a permit in Wyoming, but it's not without some restrictions. There's not a lot of unappropriated water that's available. So that 130 to 150,000 acre foot goal, acre foot per year, was pretty ambitious. And there's been a number of water projects that have been developed. Colorado developed a project called the Tamarack Project in northeastern Colorado. Nebraska, it actually came about through some periphery licensing of Lake McConaughey. There is a 100,000 acre foot environmental account in Lake McConaughey, and it has the ability to grow to 200,000 acre feet, depending on the contents of that reservoir. And that EA account accrues water in the amount of 10% of the inflows into that reservoir from March. So there's a 10, so that's building up EA water, and I'll talk a little bit about what that water is used for. And then in Wyoming, Wyoming pledged to build a Pathfinder modification project. That was completed in 2012, and of that, and for those of you who are not maybe familiar with that project, the reservoir spillway was raised 2.4 feet in round numbers. And that allowed the reservoir to recapture 54,000 acre feet of space that had been lost to sediment. And that reservoir has a 1904 priority date. So in as far as water was then 54,000 acre feet of space with a 1904 permit. 34,000 acre feet of that space was pledged towards environmental purposes. So it's called the environmental account. The other 20,000 acre feet is the Wyoming account, and Wyoming is allowed to use that for three specific purposes. One is to provide municipal water in the basin. Other municipal water sources are called out due to regulation. And that's happened a little bit, not very much. The second reason would be to use that water for compliance with the Nebraska v. Wyoming settlement that was settled in 2001. Wyoming has some replacement water obligations. And the third reason that it could be used for additional water resources for the Platte River Recovery Program. So those three sources that I just mentioned account for 80,000 acre feet of water per year towards that 130,000 acre foot goal. Another big aspect of the program was monitoring these four species. Regulations doing, and also bringing to bear a number of research projects that, get into the biology. What works, what do piping plovers like when they're nesting? What kind of habitat? Cranes, what is their preferred habitat? And some of the assumptions that have been made in developing the program. And so I've got their test hypotheses used to develop the Platte or the PRIP, and that's called adaptive management. Within that adaptive management, there's a couple of things that have been proposed by the service, and one of those is short duration high flows. And that's a concept that if you bring periodic high flows into that river, that it will scour that river bottom, it will remove some of that vegetation, and it will build sandbar islands. The sandbar islands are important because plovers and terns nest on them, and whooping cranes, when they roost on the river, roost in either shallow water or on these shallow islands, or shallow islands. There's also then a hypothesis that in a certain section of the river, it is sediment poor, means that it's down cutting. And of course, we've all heard the tales of the Platte River of 150 years ago that it was a mile wide and an inch deep. And if you see those pictures, very few trees. It's trying to then, so some of the hypotheses that are being tested is what happens when we put sediment in the river. Can we build these islands that ultimately the species would use? So I mentioned the governance committee and how that operates. Okay, so with regards to costs of the first program, pretty staggering cost. $317,330,000. That was the estimated budget for 15 years of operation. The cost shares of that, and it's important that you know the cost shares because the federal government is paying for the predominant or most of the cost of this program. $187 million in cash that the federal government has authorized, and the Bureau of Reclamation, it comes through their budget, has been bringing to this program. The $187 million is the total price. I'll get to the Bureau's cost breakdown. There's also about $130 million in cash equivalents. And that would be water that's brought to the program by the 3 states. And there were 2 land contributions that were made as part of the first increment. Are Bureau of Department of Interior, Bureau of Reclamation, $157 million in cash over this 13-year period. The state shares are, Colorado was $24 million, and it received a credit for water of $15 million, and I'm rounding these numbers off. Nebraska's share was $83 million, and that was the value of the water that was brought forward out of the McConaughey project. And then Wyoming's share was $6 million in cash and $31 million credit for water and land. Excuse me, Nebraska had a land component as well. So on Wyoming's share, that $6 million was funded out of the Water Development Program, Water Development Account 1, and that's, I believe, the 2006 appropriation. And then the cash equivalent was the credit that we got for Pathfinder EA account. There was a piece of property that Wyoming had acquired in the 1980s around Kearney, Nebraska, called the Wyoming property. And that property was purchased to offer to the Fish and Wildlife Service as mitigation for the 404 permit for the Deer Creek Reservoir project. And, anybody remember the Deer Creek project? Senator Geis, certainly Senator Meyer. It was a project that Wyoming had brought through the Water Development Program. Construction drawings were completed and approved, and we were ready to go to bid when Nebraska sued us. And it was caught up in that Nebraska v. Wyoming litigation. Ultimately, as part of the settlement, Wyoming agreed to give up its plans for the Deer Creek project, and one of those requirements was that the property we acquired would be given to the Fish and Wildlife Service for this program or some other entity that the service would designate. And as it turns out, that transaction happened in 2012, and the land is now held by the program. Part of the 10,000 acres that were to be acquired as part of this program.
Eric, I got a question. That total, it says total program cost $317, and then all this other stuff down below that comprises that, or are we, in addition to that, $500 million total?
No, Commissioner Bettis, that 317 is the total project program, and that includes cash, water, and land. So if you add up all of those numbers, Colorado share, Wyoming, Nebraska, and the Bureau, you should get $317 million. Otherwise, I made a mistake. And I should say that the cost sharing that was agreed to was that the federal government would pay for half of the program, roughly half, and the states then would pick up the other half. And so, again, with the credit that's being provided for water and land, it's not a 50-50 on a cash basis. It's 50-50 on all of the contributions that are being paid.
Harry, while we're looking at this, this is kind of in the past here, but the the price of water, especially in Colorado, has gone up appreciably. And so now, are they just giving the 15 million in cash, or are they giving some amount of acre feet that's available to the South Platte River?
So here's how the water program works. And so let me use Wyoming's project, Pathfinder modification. It's got a 34,000 acre foot account with a 1904 water rate, which is a very good water rate. Of 20,000 acre foot per year. And the score is based on water made available at Grand Island, Nebraska. And so what goes into that score, and that's what one of the things the program does, and in fact, Brian, you're on the score. Yeah. How they score projects, in Pathfinder's case, they look at, okay, when you release water in Pathfinder Reservoir, there are conveyance losses from Pathfinder to the state line. Those are subtracted away. There's also losses from Nebraska State, or from the state line down to McConaughey. There are evaporation losses in both reservoirs that are subtracted from that score, and then there's conveyance losses that run from McConaughey down to Grand Island. Also, even though we have a 1904 water right, there are some years that Pathfinder does not fill. And so all of that's taken into consideration when they develop the score. The score is 20,000 acre feet. The Tamarack project is scored at 10,000, and I wasn't part of the financial document that went into the 2007 plan, but the value of water, they basically decided what they needed as cash to run the program, and then they set a value of water for those three projects to come up with this 50-50 share. And we'll get to where the program is planning to go, and we'll get in, maybe I'll talk about that cost of water a little bit more. Okay, it's not, the valuation is not set at what can we sell water for. It's more of, I'll say, somewhat of a marketplace review, but it's also a cost of where that water is actually provided to the system. So in Pathfinder's case, it's got a long trip to make before it gets to Grand Island, Nebraska. And there's discounts that are taken out of that. So in that initial document that started this program, it was envisioned that after the first increment was complete in 13 years, there would be a second increment. And the goals for that increment, or second increment, were that there would be made available to the program not 10,000 acres of habitat, 29,000 acres of habitat. And that's a very large number, but that habitat number could include lands currently owned by conservation organizations enter into a management agreement with the program so that they would be managed somewhat consistently for endangered species purposes. So we have operating in this reach of the river, the Nature Conservancy has some fairly large land holdings. The Crane Trust, Audubon Society they all have land holdings currently in the valley. And if you look at their holdings currently, plus what the program has acquired, there's about 29,000 plus acres available. So in terms of a second increment, that 29,000 is a large number, but I think those lands are largely conserved at this point in time. Secondly, certainly species monitoring would continue, adaptive management, we've talked about that. But here's the big number that I want to scare you a little bit.
417,000 acre feet a year.
The second increment, and this is a number that the service came up with in 1990. They believe that to recover these species, 17,000 acre feet of water per year. And that would come from the 3 states. That's somewhat equivalent to, it's a little bit less than the contents of Glendale Reservoir. So if you go by Glendale Reservoir, it's full right now. It's about that much water per year that the service is saying we need for endangered species. And they agreed in the first increment that we'll get started and we'll pursue this 130 to 150,000 acre foot number first. So that number, well, I didn't say this, but in the first increment, we have not currently met that 130 to 150,000 acre foot goal. We are short of that by some 20 to 30,000 acre foot per year. So we've had trouble getting to 130,000 acre feet. You can imagine the trouble that we'll have trying to get to 417,000. And that number, if it were implemented, would definitely would impact irrigators up and down both the South and the North Platte River. So, what is now being proposed by the governance committee is that we, at the end of 2019, we will not move to a second increment, but instead we will move to an extension of the first increment. And the reason for that extension is that we haven't met the water goal. So, for example, when we talk to the service and they say, we kind of point to them that we don't think these short duration high flows will actually build the habitat you're interested in. Their response is always, we don't have the water assets to fully test the hypotheses. So they keep falling back. We don't have the water that you agreed to provide. And so what has been negotiated now is that we will go into a 13-year extension of the first increment, start in 2020, run to 2032. Within that extension, then, would be a land goal to acquire an additional 1,500 acres of land. And this is just basically riverine or bottom habitat, river bottom habitat. I think that one's fairly easy to accomplish, but we've already acquired 10,000, and I think another 1,500 can be accomplished. The water goal has been revised somewhat downward, 120,000 acre foot per year. And the reasoning behind that is that the service recognizes that as we try to acquire additional water, it's expensive. And so what they have said is, let's shoot for a goal of 120,000 acre feet per year. But if the science shows that we need more water, then the goal becomes 130,000 acre feet of water. The estimated cost for that additional 10,000 acre feet of water for the period is $40 million. And so we were able to make an impact on the service to say, really, another $40 million to acquire this 10,000 acre feet of water. Can we maybe back that off? And the service did agree with that one provision that if the science shows we need 130,000 acre feet, that is the goal. The science will continue, the adaptive management will continue, and I will tell you, in the last 10 years, we've made some kind of real strides in kind of disproving some of the hypotheses that the Bureau of Services put forward. And the program will continue to be managed by the governance committee. So what's
A question I have, we've had high flows in the North Platte the last couple, 3 years. That's probably exceeded that 417,000 acre feet on an annual basis, hasn't it? And why isn't that enough to test their hypothesis?
Have you been listening into the governance committee discussions? Because that's exactly what Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, have been saying. We've had high flow events in 2010, 2011, 2013 that put much more water in there for your short duration high flows. And what it's showing is you can't build island habitat with those flows. We point that out to the service, and their response is, we've not been able to adequately test our hypotheses because we don't have the water assets in place. So part of what I think is, and I think I've got a bullet to this extent, one of the important things with the program and why I'm certainly going to be recommending the program is when the program's in place, it is the program that is directing the research. It is the program that's designed. And the service is part of that, but it's not the service. Without the program, it will be the Fish and Wildlife Service that is designing the science, and they always throw out best available science. Right now, their best available science is 17,000 acre-feet of water per year. And part of it's, Senator Meyer, is the term, or the timing of that water. I mean, those two floods came down in May, June timeframe, and then there was a September. They'd like to be able to run these experiments, you know, when there's less water in the river to really see what kind of island building happens. I can tell you during those 3 high flow events, what happened was that the program has actually built some sandbar islands with heavy equipment in the river. And when we got the floods, it washed the islands away. So all of this is leading up to a body of science that we're going to be able to say short duration high flows don't work, but the service won't accept it now. And that's, so hence the need to extend the program. So let's talk about the cost of the first increment. Estimated $156 million, and that is cash and water. The Bureau of, let's see, of that, the cash portion is estimated new cash, $106 million. The cash equivalents for land and water, $50,000, and that's really just water. The Bureau of Reclamation's share of that is $78 million. So again, the feds are bringing the majority of cash to this program. The 3 state shares, Colorado will be bringing almost $25 million in cash to the program, and they're going to get a credit for water of $6.2 million. Nebraska's share is all water, valued at $31 million, and then Wyoming's share $3.1 million in cash, and about $12.5 million for the water that we're bringing from Pathfinder. Incidentally, it was back calculation, but the value that we've set for that water is right at about $50 per acre foot. And so from an ag interest standpoint, ag water, $5 an acre foot type number. We currently have a
So if you're
contract.
buying it, if you're renting it,
program,
Colorado, it's about 75
selling
to
it for
over 100.
$51 an acre foot. So that's the credit that the states are being given for that water. Okay, so let's talk about what it looks like or how Wyoming fares without a program. And this is it's a little bit interesting because the program now functions as the reasonable and prudent alternative to endangered species compliance. So when somebody, we looked at a project last summer, those new diversion structures on the Encampment River, for a permit to do that work. It can be a nationwide permit, but anytime there's a federal nexus without the program, there will be a separate Section 7 consultation with that individual water user. And what they typically then ask for is cash to help service run the program, and they want water. So that's one federal nexus that we also so they're looking at federal or 404 permits, federal permitting for projects. Let me here's an example. So we have everybody's, I think, has heard about the drinking water SRF program, drinking water state revolving fund. Part of those funds come from EPA to the state to manage for water projects. Okay. You can expect a separate Section 7 consultation for each and every one of those projects. And interestingly,
In about 1998, Douglas was proposing a water project. They wanted to build some transmission lines in the community. They wanted to build a new water tank, and they approached the rural development folks, part of USDA, for federal funding. And that triggered a biological opinion on what the impacts of Douglas is on these endangered species. Here is the biological opinion. And I don't know what it cost to put this document together, but here's the conclusion of this opinion. And this is for building water lines and a water storage tank. It's not talking about new water appropriations. It says the Douglas Municipal Project, as proposed, is likely to jeopardize the continued existence of the least tern, piping plover, and pallid sturgeon, and will result in the destruction or adverse modification of designated whooping crane critical habitat, and that such habitat loss would likely jeopardize the species' survival. That's the service's opinion, and that's the weight that they can bring through the ESA without the program. And so it wouldn't concern the water development program because it's all state money. But Drinking Water SRF, and a lot of our sponsors go to Drinking Water SRF for a loan for their share. Every one of them may have to go through a biological opinion like that, and the conclusion is you're going to jeopardize the existence of whooping cranes. And they get to that conclusion by saying every drop of water we take out of the river is less water for cranes and sturgeon, and so that's what irrigators will be looking at. And then lastly, in terms of
Damn endangered species in California and New
this program's
York.
not there, the service says, well, we'll have to reconsult on all water use in the basin. The federal nexus reaches out and touches every federal reservoir in the system. So in Wyoming, Guernsey, Glendo, Pathfinder, Seminole, I skipped over Gray Reef and Cordis and some of those facilities. There would be a reconsultation on the water use from those facilities. And in looking at some of the late 1990s documentation that we have in this office, because Mike Besson was involved in negotiating the program, they had their sites on what is called re-regulation space in Glendo Reservoir, 100,000 acre feet of space that they felt could be used for endangered species in lieu of irrigation that it's now used for. They'll reconsult on Pathfinder, not the modification project, the whole Pathfinder reservoir, and they will probably insist that a portion of that water be not allocated for irrigators as it is today. It would be allocated for endangered species in the Central Platte. And a couple of examples of consultations outside of this state. Klamath River Basin, biological opinion, came forward with an environmental account of 320,000 acre feet of water. Out of those federal projects, again, that's what ESA grabbed for endangered species there. And then in the California Central Valley project, that biological opinion project in and around the Central Valley generates about 7 million acre feet of water per year average. ESA, or Fish and Wildlife Service, ended up with 1.2 million acre feet of water that was set aside for fish, wildlife, and of course, before 1973, those projects were located.
That's it. I gotta sell
They
my
were able
water
to
to the
come in
federal
and
government.
negotiate or grab that amount of
Move,
water out of those two
to an island.
basins. So
Someplace.
benefits that I guess I would offer for a program, you avoid those Section 7 consultations. So again, back to the Encampment River project, they were able to apply for a nationwide 404 permit on those. They received them. There was no discussion of, well, we need water, we need money, because all of that coverage is applied through or is being received through the program. Water demands coming to Wyoming. The governance committee oversees the development of water projects. So again, trying to meet the 120,000 acre feet of water per year. The adaptive management program continues with governance committee oversight, not just Fish and Wildlife Service. The entire program. So here's, and I think this is important because when we talk about these issues with the program, there are water users sitting around the table. The 3 states are there expressing their opinions and guiding this process. If the program is not there, it is strictly Fish and Wildlife Service that will be driving this program. And then other thing that I think the program provides is, I call it regulatory certainty. So if you were to develop a new project or even an existing project, like the diversion structures, there is regulatory certainty with this program in place. You don't have to deal with Fish and Wildlife Service. It's all handled by this program. And with this extension that's been negotiated now, we're talking about 13 years of regulatory certainty. And if you talk to water users up and down the Platte right now and ask them, have you had any problem with endangered species in Nebraska in the last 10 years, the answer is no. It's because this program has provided that coverage. So the last thing then, Wyoming's dollar cost is $3.1 million. It's half of what the last 13 years cost. And I think my thoughts, of course, I did work on the negotiations of this, is that $3.1 million is money well spent, because it allows our water users, both municipalities, irrigators, and others, to continue, I won't say unimpeded, but certainly without the regulatory burden of ESA staring them in the face every time they want to do something with regards to their water systems. So I think that is it.
Okay, I got one quick question. So from 2007 to 2019, we had this 317 million that was going to be spent. How much of that has been actually spent?
So it's 187 million.
Oh, excuse me.
In the first increment. And in round numbers, well, let me give you a number that by the end of 2019, we expect to spend about 120 million of that, 125 million. And the reason it's not all being spent is because we've been unable to move water projects forward. That's why we haven't met the water goal. And so it is planned that those dollars will move forward into the extension of the program.
So that money is appropriated on what kind of a basis then?
So Colorado has completed its appropriation. It was 24 million. Those appropriations are complete. Wyoming's appropriation happened in 2006, and that money is managed by the Water Development Office in an account specifically for this program. So when they have an expenditure or they're planning ahead and they have multiple expenditures, they will ask for Wyoming's share of those expenditures. And Wyoming's share is about 3.8% of total cost. And so those dollars are forwarded then to the program. And the federal government's appropriation process, they appropriate those funds on an annual basis. So the remaining fiscal year 18 and 19 appropriations have not been made from the federal government standpoint.
Representative Blake.
This 12 years, how are those 4 critters doing? You made a dent, saving their lives, or plus kind of a follow-up, I've heard there's a new sheriff in town, and they've been looking at the Endangered Species Act and new Secretary of the Interior. Do you see any of that coming down may change some of this? Thank you.
So with regards to the species, and I was looking up, this is an interesting statistic. So currently there's about 350 whooping cranes in North America, in the US and Canada. They only exist here. Their low point was in, what, 1941, I think. There was like 39 birds was all that was left. And so there's been improvement there. And then I happened to look up a little tidbit on Wikipedia that they estimated in 1880 that there was between 500 and 750 whooping cranes. They've never been a prolific species. Now, by the 1880s, market hunting could have already taken a toll on their population, but there's never been very many of those birds. And we are seeing gains in that species. The difficulty with certainly whooping cranes is their largest threat to mortality is on their winter range in Texas when they migrate several thousand miles to Canada for their nesting. And so it's difficult to think that you're going to recover a species just in the Central Platte, because that species only spends about a month's worth of its life cycle in the spring when it migrates through, and maybe 2 or 3 weeks in the fall. It doesn't spend much time in the Central Platte. But this is from a bird standpoint. I mean, this Central Platte is pretty amazing from an ecology standpoint. 800 or so, well, I shouldn't say 800,000, but there are hundreds of thousands of sandhill cranes that move through this little section of the Platte River. Waterfowl, I mean, it is very rich from a biological standpoint, and the service's intent is to try to preserve as much of that as possible. They use the endangered species to do that. Least terns, since they were listed, they've actually discovered that there's more populations of those, I think, in the southern Mississippi River Valley. And so that's actually a species that's a candidate for delisting. We know how delisting works. We follow the wolf process, and 10 or so years later, you're still fighting with delisting. But that species has a real chance of being delisted probably in the next 10 years. Plovers are still going to be there, but again, we're dealing with a fairly small population in the Central Platte because those plovers exist on the Missouri River and other places. And then the sturgeon has its own story. And that is that most of the fish in the Platte are thought to be hatchery fish that came out of the Missouri River. They also exist in the Missouri River, and there's a major recovery program there for pallid sturgeon. And at least the tidbits of information I hear is that the pallid is not making, I mean, they've spent a lot of money trying to recover the species, and with limited success. So Service is very interested in trying to preserve whatever populations they have, including this lower Platte River segment. With regards to the new administration, which has talked about endangered species or Endangered Species Act amendments, I don't know that you can plan on that. We watch what happens in Washington, D.C. If something happens, we would react to that. But I don't think you're going to see ESA go away, my opinion. It'll be there in some form.
Questions for Harry?
Mr. Chair,
Commissioner Evans.
my math shows that this program cost about 14 million a year in cash the first 13 years, and that's going to drop to, of which Wyoming paid about 500,000 per year, and that's going to drop about in half to 8 million and 250. Why the drop?
Why the drop?
Yeah.
Well, so we're moving from a recovery/development program, bringing new water assets on board and acquiring land. And so the land acquisition, and I don't recall the budget in the first increment, but 10,000 acres of land, you're paying for that. And now in the second, or the extension, it's 1,500 acres. And so it's shifting from more of an acquisition program to a management program. Those costs are reduced as a result of that.
Hey, on your last slide, benefits to Wyoming. Are those theoretical, or did these things occur in the last 11 years? I mean, were Section 7 consultations avoided, or is that theoretical, is my question, I guess.
Well, with regards to these 4 species, there have not been any separate Section 7 consultations as a result of those in Wyoming that I'm aware of. There may have been on other projects, and by other projects, I'm talking about non-water projects, don't know. But this program has provided that coverage.
Questions for Harry? Okay, thanks, Harry. Oh, Senator Hicks.
Harry, getting back to the issue of the permit activity and which you alluded to earlier, has there been any discussion with the governance committee to look at trying to initiate a conversation with the service to do a programmatic biological opinion for a range of projects? You're familiar with the Colorado River Recovery Program, where they've done those programmatic biological opinions, or is it the purpose of the recovery implementation program to actually cover that?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, it is the latter. This program covers that. So Wyoming, the 3 states are required to report their new depletions to the program. The federal government, in terms of some of their projects, even including water use for firefighting, is reported through this program to the service, and all of those uses are provided coverage under ESA through the program. So it's really broader than a programmatic coverage. It's all water use, as long as, and the service is watching that there. And I should have mentioned that one of the provisions of the 1997 agreement was that the states agreed to basically freeze their water depletions at 1997 levels. So any new water development has to fit within that 1997 cap. And so here's a good example, and this was somewhat a result of Nebraska v. Wyoming. But Nebraska was moving towards some groundwater laws. Prior to that, it was virtually unregulated. And when that word got out, they drilled thousands of wells along the North Platte River. And now they're coming back, and those were all post-1997. And so there's a requirement for the natural resource districts, which govern groundwater in Nebraska, to basically mitigate those depletions. And so they're working on water projects that also put water in the system. But this 1997 level is a ceiling, so that we're not going to go over that. And in Wyoming, we look at irrigated acres and we look at population in communities to say we're still at 1997 levels.
Mr. Chairman? The extension of that discussion is does this program apply to import water into the basin? And is the opinion then that import water has to comply with these, or is that strictly outside of the recovery program's requirements?
I don't know that the program is really taken up, and I'm thinking in Wyoming in terms of trans-basin water. That would be exempt from this. It would not be a depletion of the natural flows. But obviously any trans-basin diversion is going to get other scrutiny from ESA potentially. But and in fact, in Colorado and Wyoming for that matter, you're allowed to use those trans-basin diversions to extinction. And so
Another question there. So what about fossil water or non-tributary water? Is that subject to the agreement, or again, do we have the sole opportunity to use that to extinction? Would it be captured under this program or not?
So theoretically, I mean, it's new water. It's just like trans-basin water. It's new water. But then you get into the reality of how you count that. And so, at least in Wyoming, we have acreage caps that were negotiated and represent theoretically 1997 levels. And we operate every year under that. Municipalities, there are populations that have been set for that. And as long as we're staying under those population limits, then we're considered to be in compliance with 1997 levels. So it's not a sophistication of measurement, but so what happens for somebody that wants to bring a new water use to get forward in the basin in Wyoming is they need a permit from the state engineer's office, and there are specific requirements going into those permits that you may be required to mitigate this use at some point in the future if we get over those other limits. But, and I have not talked to the state engineer or the groundwater section, but that's a good question. If it is non-hydrologically connected groundwater, then it should not be counted, that water use. And so it shouldn't fall under the provisions of the program. Likewise, it doesn't fall under the provisions of Nebraska v. Wyoming either. Good point.
Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Wagner.
Larry, I kind of was privileged to be involved in this when it was all going on. Back then, they were talking about numbers of cranes in the system. I know that you talked about 350, 400 cranes in the United States, but the majority of those were in Florida, as I understood. Back then, it seemed like there was only like 8 or 10 cranes that came through that Nebraska habitat area where they built the great big fancy viewing area for $1 million and some odd to view the 8 cranes that came through. Can you tell me if there are more than 8 or 10 or 12 or 15 that go through Nebraska?
8. I've never seen a hooping crane. So the Florida population, it's my understanding that was an experimental population, and it was I don't know whether it still exists. I know there was a storm that went through and decimated a pretty good portion of that population. But the majority of cranes that we're talking about are cranes that winter in Texas, migrate through Nebraska on their way to Canada. And so there's been, I hazard to say a guess, but there's been 40, 50, or 100 type birds that they're seeing in central Nebraska. And that number keeps growing.
I understand that, but how many hooping cranes?
In hooping cranes.
Oh, hooping crane. Okay.
The native population, as I understand it, was this Texas to Canada population.
Questions for Harry? Okay. Moving on to the 2017 handbook.
So, Mr. Chairman, at the May meeting, we had some discussion about the selection committees, the makeup of selection committees, number of people that were on there. And we then came up with a document that said in 2011, there was supposed to be 5 members. But it dawned on me after that, you know, as a new commissioner comes on, that you get one of these notebooks that has that document in there, and I think Kellen and Larry will certainly test it. I sit down with people and go through that. But for the longer serving members, I didn't do that orientation. It would have been Mike Purcell. And so I've made new notebooks, made enough copies for everybody. I don't know that Larry or Kellen need them, but if you want another, I'll call it an orientation notebook, but it has a lot of information about the commission. And I'll just ask, do you want another copy, Nick? Clinton?
I don't need one right. Have you got an electronic one or?
This is not available electronically, so.
Now let me take a look at it.
But I guess I'm offering them up as a refresher.
I probably need one.
And well, Jerry, I forgot you, but we sat down and went through this, so you should have one of these notebooks. I'll give you notice. Anybody else? Rod,
You and I went through it.
Yeah, and if you still have it, that's
Yes, I
fine.
do.
I still have my old one. Does that count for?
And this is somewhat updated because I brought in the 2017 legislative program for planning and construction. So that's been updated. There are a couple of items I'll just make you aware of. This is under tab D, which is protocol and procedures of the Wyoming Water Development Commission. It may be, at some point in time, the commission may want to go through this and look at it, but there's a statement in here that says abstentions count as no votes. And I don't know that that is standard Robert's Rules of Order, but that's a statement that's in there that, you know, if we're going to open this up and look at it, might be possible. The other thing I would point out, you recall for commissioners that have been on more than a couple of years, we went through the conflict of interest last year and what would be the proper procedures, and the commission did adopt a procedure for that. It might be appropriate that that procedure is now brought into this this particular section. So, I mean, there's probably some need to update this at some point in time, but like I said, there were questions that came up that were in this notebook, but if you came on board 7 years ago, you may not have the notebook any longer. So we've got extra copies if you want those. And that's all I have to say about the.
Questions on the handbook?
I better hang on to this.
Well, that was pretty quick and easy. The next one would be Public Purpose Investments Report update.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, under tab A in your notebooks, and we've talked about the Management Audit Committee's program audit. But anything that the Management Audit Committee does, they produce the report, the findings, and then they want an update after 1 year's worth of time. And then they look for a final update 2 years after the project has been completed or the report provided. So I've now received the letter that you see, May 15th, 2017, from Michael Swank. And he's asking for a final or a 2-year update on a recommendation that came out on the Public Purpose Investment Report. It was produced in July of 2015. And specifically, so that dealt extensively with public purpose investments, such things as investments made on the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. Water Development has managed loans, Mineral Trust Fund, to entities to construct water treatment plants in the past. And in fact, Gillette has a permanent mineral trust and maybe 2 loans for their project that is now within a year probably of being wrapped up in total. But one of the recommendation that was targeted at Water Development and the Office of State Lands was 6.1. And specifically, the report said, well, both Water Development and State Lands handle hydropower projects. They wanted some clarification as to whether there were any conflicts in the program. And then also, we both have small water project. And they asked a question if there's any conflict or overlap with regards to those 2 programs. And so what I reported to them last year to the committee was that development, but working with State Lands, we put together, I'll call them white papers, on each of those 2 programs. So on hydropower, what Water Development does is we fund feasibility studies for hydropower, but we do not fund construction of hydropower projects. State Lands has a loan program for funding hydropower projects. And so that was all laid out in those white papers, and likewise with small water projects as well. Those were provided to the committee, and so they're asking for an update. I've not drafted a response to this. I think it's due next week, but my response, they're asking for any updates as they try to project. And my thoughts to you and my response will be that there have been no further updates, that again, both programs tend to operate independently, and there are not conflicts with regards to two programs or the two agencies. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, just for edification of the commission and the director, that didn't come out in that report, it was quite a robust debate on the floor of the Senate this year as part of the justification for the rate on the $6.2 million out of account one. And the debate that ensued was that because there was several amendments to take some money out of the Wyoming Business Council program to restore that back, use that to fund the state engineers and let the money stay in 6.2, was that the Wyoming Business Council does all these water projects too. So what difference does it make whether we leave that money, just leave it in the Wyoming Business Council for water projects? And so there's a perception, at least in the Senate side, that you're overlapping with programs with the Wyoming Business Council, which I think we all recognize is not happening, but certainly that perception is in the legislature right now, and it was part of the justification not to support the amendment to use those funds to restore full funding to account one. So it's worth noting as we move forward that may be something that we want to provide some clarification through either a technical bulletin or a memo, is the overlap between, clearly still does water projects, but that's from the treatment plant and does the curb and the gutter type lay the water lines. They don't do the raw water, but there is a significant level of confusion between those programs.
Mr. Chairman,
Commissioner Bettis.
well, I guess Nephi left too early. I was going to ask him, from a budget standpoint then, Harry, have you gotten any direction from the governor with regard to what Senator Hicks is talking about, and I think a couple of commissioners have brought this up before with the general fund taking some pretty good hits. We wondered if there was anything that we should be doing through the planning part of this while still keeping there's water plan from a budget standpoint, and I don't think we have heard that. And I think it's important not only from what goes on in the legislature, so that we understand what is going on from a funding standpoint, because I think some of us, and I'm included in this, I think we should be doing our part. Now, I guess we are to a certain extent funding out of account one, the state engineers admin costs, I guess, for lack of a better word, plus the rate on account three with the but I guess it would be nice to know what the plan is coming forth from the governor for the upcoming, from our perspective.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Bettis, I've not had any conversations with the governor's office with regards to that topic. I'll tell you that we're just now getting our instructions for the budget. That's an agency budget and request, which is due to the governor end of August typically, and then the governor formulates his budget proposal. So it'll probably be later in the fall where I will sit down with the governor to discuss at least the agency budget and going forward. But at this point in time, reference tax distributions into water accounts 1, 2, and 3 remain intact and unchanged. And so that revenue continues to move into those accounts. But we just have the additional diversion for the state engineer's office.
More questions for Harry? Comments, concerns? Okay. Next item was open meeting laws with Daniel.
Mr. Chairman.
New LSO staff. Huh? Is this a new LSO staff down here? No, I don't recognize him. There's some Chris, huh?
Ray Daniel's here to illuminate us.
Okay. I think his name is Brian.
Once again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I'll be giving a brief overview of the Public Meetings Act. And at any time, feel free to stop me if you have any kind of general question about how the act applies. Question? That's probably something more we could talk about maybe after the meeting or the executive session. So I just want you to be a little aware of that. With that, let's get going. The purpose of the Public Meetings Act. This commission and all the agencies of Wyoming are there to serve the public. And as a result, their conduct and deliberations are supposed to be presented openly, pretty much all of the time. And the purpose of this is so that we have an open and accountable government. So before we get into the specifics of the act, it's important to legislature put some real teeth in here. So there's both monetary and non-monetary penalties. So from the monetary side, if there's a knowing or intentional violation of the provisions of the act, you could be liable up for a civil penalty up to $750. And what's even more, this I kind of like to call this the getting out of bed in the morning liability. If you just show up at the meeting and you know that there's a violation of the act, you can also be liable unless you put an objection on the record, either at the meeting or at the next meeting. So from a non-monetary perspective, there's also some pretty severe sanctions. If there is a violation, any action taken at the meeting is null and void. So we have to, do it all over again. So it's pretty important to try and comply with the act if possible. And then finally, the most significant thing, I think we all know that we need the support and trust and confidence of the public, and violations of the act kind of take away from that. So let's move into the basic components of the act. There's three things: the scope of the act, that is there a public meeting? Does this even apply to you? The notice procedures, that's whether the public has sufficient notice to show up and participate. And then finally, the exceptions, occasions when you can exclude the public. So the scope of the act, is there a public meeting? So the act only applies to agencies, including this commission. It only applies to agencies that are created by statute, the Constitution, or by ordinance. And this is a pretty important distinction to make. It only really applies to an agency with a governing body. So we're talking about a group having ultimate control of the agency. So it would apply to the commission. It wouldn't necessarily apply to the office because there's only a governing body of one. So a public meeting is defined as an assembly of at least a quorum of the governing body called by proper authority. Purpose of discussion, deliberation, presentation of information, or taking action regarding public business. As you can see, it's pretty broad. So even if you don't do anything, it could be considered a public meeting. Just for your information, this is actually in your rules right now. The quorum is 6 members. And about 5 years ago, the legislature actually made this even broader. So they added this provision here, which has yet to be tested by a Wyoming court. But it says pretty much that any kind of communications outside a meeting among the members of the agency shall not be used to circumvent the purpose of the act. And so what does this mean? Well, we don't know, but at least one legal scholar has said that any kind of communication, an email, that would take the place of the kind of discussion or deliberation that you would have in the meeting would be a violation. And so what does that mean? Well, if it's a group email to the entire commission, that could be considered a circumvention of the purpose of the act. If you send group texts, there's like a Facebook group. I mean, I can even imagine Snapchat or something like that could be considered a public meeting. And then all of those previous things we talked about, that $750 penalty could kick in. It would also include informal conversations at dinner and potentially, you know, this has never been tested, potentially any form of communication about public business. So the best practice, because we don't yet know how a court will deal with this, the best practice is if you're going to say something in the meeting, just don't say it outside of the meeting. So that covers the scope of the act. Let's move on to notice procedures. The purpose of this is we want to make sure that the public can be involved. They have to know when your meeting is. They have to know what exactly is going to be discussed so that they can be informed and involved. So the notice depends on the type of meeting. There's 4 different types of meetings: regular, special, emergency, and administrative meetings. So the WWDC does not have any regular meetings, so we'll just go through this very quickly. But this is essentially a regular business meeting that's in statute, where the actual day, such as the first Tuesday of each month, is prescribed by bylaws, statute, rule, regulation. So we don't have any of these, which means almost all of our meetings are special meetings. So special meetings, they occur when the presiding officer, the chairman, gives notice to each member of the governing body and to each member of the media who requests notice. The notice must specify the time and place of the meeting, the business to be transacted, and this is really important. No other business may be conducted unless it's essentially in the agenda. And so that means that if you want to add something to the agenda, you should try and add it at least 8 hours prior. Let the director know so we can put it on there. This is a little flexible. The agenda should be specific. It doesn't need to be exact. So we have one case that has dealt with this, where like the term personnel decisions was considered just fine to put the community on notice that they were talking about potentially firing teachers. So the key is, does it provide fair and reasonable notice so that the public would, if they're interested, be able to come? And that's just kind of the touchstone. So move on to emergency meetings. These are very, very rare. This is only for matter of serious and immediate concern. You have to have reasonable efforts to offer public notice, and all actions are temporary and must be acted upon in a special meeting within 48 hours. The reason why we don't have these is you only need to give 8 hours notice. So if something, you know, important comes up, you can just have a special meeting. Finally, you have administrative meetings. No notice is required for these meetings. This is very limited, though. This is essentially logistics, meetings about, you know, where you guys are going to dinner. There's no requirement for notice. So we move on to the exceptions. Under what circumstances may the public be excluded? Once again, the general rule is it's open at all times. So only, you know, courts interpret this very narrowly. So if you don't hit the requirements for exclusion, it's going to be considered a public meeting. If you don't let the public in, it's going to be considered a violation, and all of those stakes, all of those penalties kick in. So the two exceptions, the big one is executive session, which we'll spend most of our time talking about. And also, I just threw this in there as well, disruption of public meetings. So you are actually allowed to kick someone out if they're a little bit rowdy. So like I said, executive session is very limited. You can only go into executive session if one of 11 statutorily enumerated reasons are there. If it's not one of those reasons, you can't go in there. The ones that we usually deal with are legal advice, discussion of litigation, personal issues, and real estate transactions. Also, from a procedural perspective, it's just as stringent. You need a motion, you need a second, you need a majority vote. And the motion must specify the reasons for the executive session. I move to go into executive session to receive legal advice. Once you're in session, you can only discuss the topic announced in the motion. And this is really important because I bolded it, but no action may be taken during the executive session. So any action in there, null and void. And then just to let you know, this is the smaller exception. I don't think it ever happens. But the governing body may order the removal of any person or group who willfully disrupts or interrupts the meeting. So if someone is trying to interrupt the meeting, you can remove them. And so that wraps up most of the major components. There's 3 additional provisions that I just want to mention briefly. So that's when can the commission recess, what kind of minutes have to be taken, and what kind of information does the public have to provide. So as far as recess, you can recess from any regular or special meeting. The key is you have to let the public know. So you have to let them know the specified place and the time. Copy the order and stick it on the door. So if someone walks by and say, where the heck is everybody? They can come back in a couple hours. As far as minutes, minutes are required to be recorded for every single meeting except administrative meetings. And that includes executive session, although those minutes can't be produced absent a court order. And if you're not taking any action, you're not required to actually publish those. So finally, an agency can't limit admission because we want the public to come as much as possible. So you can't require someone to put down their name, provide any information. The only time you can is if they want to come up and talk to you. So if they seek recognition, they have to give their name and affiliation. So that's pretty much it. The major takeaways, once again, the scope of the act, you need a quorum properly called for express purpose of public business, or we have that very vague provision lurking out there that if you have any communication that a court might consider a circumvention of the act, well, you could potentially be liable. As far as notice procedures, the key is the 8-hour rule. Make sure you get anything you want on the agenda to the director at least 8 hours before so you can send out a notice. And then finally, executive session, you need a motion, a second. You need to provide a statutory reason, have a majority vote, and once again, no action is allowed. So that's pretty much it. Does anybody have any questions?
A hypothetical for you.
Commissioner Lancaster, and then you, Senator Meyer. Go ahead, Kelly.
So what determines the person who's obnoxious or causing trouble in the meeting? Who's going to decide that?
So I believe it's decided in the first instance by the commission, but there is a procedure where they can challenge that determination in court later on. So generally they should be pretty obnoxious, I think, before you kick them out.
Good question. Who handles it? Who handles the removal?
Well, the statute frankly doesn't say. I was talking to Abby earlier, and I think Harry, Barry, and Brian should. But sorry, I shouldn't leave out Jason too. I didn't see him on the poll. But the statute doesn't say, it's unclear. We don't have any case law on it, probably because, frankly, most people are pretty respectful here, I think.
Yeah. Okay, you're in executive session. It was called in to seek legal advice on a specific matter. And then somebody brings up one of the other 10 things, let's say it has to do something with personnel, you know, and somebody says during the executive session, look, you know, we came in here to talk about this. We've talked about it. All right, I'm leaving the meeting. So the executive session breaks up and that personnel issue comes up. And is that when when somebody would say, I object to hearing this at this point in time because it was talked in executive session? And then who is subject to what penalty at that point in time? And how does that necessarily work? Because I know that school boards do this all the time.
Hospital board, city commissioners.
Yeah.
So the first thing you hope is that, you know, the attorney, whoever is in my position, kind of shuts you down and says, well, look, we can't really talk about that right now. But what you do is you have to wait until you come out of executive session, because you have to make your objection in public, and then you have to put it on the minutes. So that would govern how you kind of hopefully extricate yourself from that situation, although of course we hope that situation never occurs. As far as the penalties, it's going to be based on whether there was a knowing or intentional violation. So the person who brought up the personnel issue, and then he was told, hopefully, by his attorney that, no, we can't really do that. You know, what we really need to do is let's leave executive session, go back on the record, you guys make another motion, say, hey, we got to talk about personnel issues, and then go back into executive session. But if your attorney tells you that, well, at that point, everybody on the commission or whoever's in that executive session knows there's a violation. All potentially liable unless, like I said, afterwards, you know, after the executive session breaks up, they go on the record and they say, I don't like how this was handled. I want to put that in the minutes so everybody knows we really need to do a motion.
Attorney be in violation of this public meetings law if he wasn't properly informed the members of the commission as to what was actually going on?
Well, I would say first, there's a potential that he might be liable for malpractice. I just want to throw that out there. But I don't think under the act he would be liable, because if you recall earlier, we talked about how the act only applies to agencies, and agencies are defined as you know, commissions that have a governing body. The attorney wouldn't be part of that. So because he's not a member of the governing party. But like I said, I'm pretty sure
though, right?
Well,
Change the law. Okay.
I would just say the attorney would be in some trouble probably. Maybe not under the act.
More questions, Harry?
Absolutely no discussion.
So yes, there would need to be some sort of complaint in court. It's enforced in court, and we haven't had a lot of. There's, I think, a total of 12 Wyoming Supreme Court cases that have dealt with this issue, and almost all of them deal with members of the media bringing the case because they've been excluded and they believe they've been excluded improperly. So it's usually enforced in court.
I guess to ask the question further, so actually, let's say you were aware that this happened, what would you do? Appearance between the circuit court and file a complaint?
I believe that would be, Mr. Chairman, I believe that would be the appropriate manner to deal with this.
Any restriction for taping of any of the meetings you mentioned?
Mr. Chairman, just to clarify, you're talking about electronic recording of the... Yes, so there is a restriction. Well, I guess I would say there would be a restriction of releasing an electronic recording of an executive session, for instance. Like we talked about earlier, you can't release any minutes or recording of the executive session absent a court order. But other than that, I don't believe that there is any prohibition against recording. And in fact, we do generally record our meetings.
Questions for Daniel? Representative Blake.
So, like a county commission, I know, they go to their first part of the meeting, then they all go to lunch together. And I'm not sure what they talk about, but if a media person was sitting next to them, they were talking about something later on their agenda, did that media person file the complaint? Them having lunch together and talking about it?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure whether that media member would have standing or not, but I would suspect, and like I said, I haven't looked into this very deeply, I would suspect they could, because essentially they would, the way I would see it is that they were being excluded from a public meeting. And if you have I'm saying if you had a quorum, and they were trying to, under that provision, that broad provision, communications to circumvent the purpose of the act, I think there's a pretty decent argument to be made that, yeah.
Questions? I think that's it. Daniel, thanks. Well, with that, that's the last item on our agenda. Is there anything burning with you, Harry?
Violations are happening every day. Oh, that's the case.
Meeting adjourned.